Welcome to the Green Spoon podcast. Thanks for joining us today. So I'm really excited this morning because I have my cousins here for this podcast, Victoria, known to me as Mouse, and William. And today we're going to talk about broad brush food systems, farming, and our love of food generally. Fun fact, most of our cousins, all of us, are in land, food, farming of some sort. So here we all are in 2024 talking about that. So just to set some context, Mouse, why don't you introduce yourself first?
I've been working in, smallholder agriculture generally for about 13 years now, and always with a kind of edge of digital. So being in Kenya and obviously being really inspired by the way M-Pesa took over our lives or, made our lives so much better. I think that has been a really exciting part of my career anyway so far. Just thinking about what mobile phones specifically can do for farmers in terms of getting better information, market access. So that's really kind of what I've focused on mostly the last 13 years. That's probably some good context for now.
Yeah, that's really good. And Will?
So background, obviously I grew up here, but I've mainly been based in the UK. I've been based in the UK since really studying at uni, which was 20 years ago, over 20 years ago. Makes me feel so old.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it was really at uni where I became a Christian and did a course on theology, looking particularly at ecology and ethics, which was the thing that blew my mind and just made me realize how important caring for the whole created order, the whole natural world is. And I was reading a lot of Wendell Berry, hero of the kind of American farmer, for those who don't know, who wrote a lot, and he's influenced a lot of people in the regenerative farming movement. But I read a lot of him, and that was a really helpful person to have started with, I think, because he set me on the track of recognizing how important food and farming are for everything, and how important farmers are, and the vital role they play in our whole lives, and how actually if we're to care for the planet as a whole, it starts with food. What we put on our plate is the daily reminder of how we looking after everything else. So that's really been the driving force since that, whatever it was, 20 years ago. Yeah, that's been the driving agenda for my wife and I. And so we're involved in things in the UK. At the moment, I'm working for the Soil Association. Before that, I was running a food hub, smaller version of Green Spoon in Bristol. And I've been working on a farm for a bit as well. And yeah, just done a few different things. So that's the background.
That's really cool. So Will, you're over here visiting home. When you are sort of driving around and doing stuff and seeing how we're farming, are there things that you're learning or you've learned over the last 20 years, maybe influenced by Wendell Berry or by Jubilee Food Hub or even by the Soil Association now, which is slightly more recent? But are there things that you're seeing where you're like, we're doing things differently and better, or there are gaps that we need to think about?
Well, I think the big things for me for a good food system would be relationships being at the heart of it, and justice at the heart of it. And you've got the capacity here, I think, because you've got such a relational food system. Like there's so, I think it's something like 95% of food is sold outside of supermarkets here or something. Whereas the opposite in the UK, like we've got 95% of food is sold to us by 6 companies. It's almost like a big monopoly. And so the justice angle and the relationship angle are just, there's no relationship in the UK because you don't know where your food's come from. So here I feel like you've got a much better opportunity to have relationships because you don't have supermarkets taking over the world.
Yeah. And I think culturally as well, everyone here loves to chat and to feel connected. And so I remember like when we moved out, I remember thinking, it's so annoying. Why can't we just do everything over email? And then I realized that there's so much benefit to actually having relationships and seeing people and understanding them and taking the time. Yeah. And everyone in the UK seems so time strapped.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, time, convenience, these idols that we've put in place before other things. So it's kind of, convenience and efficiency. Ultimately, I mean, they're great, but sometimes we make them too important. So it's great to just recognize relationships are more important than those other things. So
yeah. So you'd put relationships right at the heart of food systems. In your experience with using mobile phones to enhance how farmers are able to farm, do you think that that just moves from the interpersonal relationship to a different kind of relationship?
I think there's always a bit of a mix. So I think if you take information that farmers might want to get a hold of to learn about, let's say, moving from conventional farming to regenerative, for example, maybe that, they once upon a time on their farm, they might have farmed with their family in a more regenerative or sustainable way, but then with the introduction of more like chemicals and companies and agro dealers or agro vet shops that are incentivized to sell those products, they've kind of maybe forgotten some of those techniques. So if you're a smallholder farmer in Kenya and you're trying to find information about, maybe you just want to figure out how to do mint. I mean, I think most farmers probably already know that, but maybe they just want a refresher. The ratio of extension workers to farmers in Kenya is something like one extension officer who's like a trainer to 4,000 or 5,000 farmers. I think that was a stat that we used to have anyway. So it just means that they're learning from each other, which is amazing. But if you wanted to access new information or learn, mobile phones is just one channel where you could get that information, whether you're looking at YouTube videos, if you have a smartphone with data, or you could be supported by a company that is really keen to help farmers like get access to information, basically. So in the early days, it was, we worked when I was with the GSMA in London, worked a lot with mobile network operators, like, so an example being, Airtel or Safaricom, where they already have a huge customer base and they could offer them free SMS messages about whether it's, a weather information or market prices, or trying to provide timely information. It is really tough to get it right because obviously every farm is different. People are planting different seeds or growing at different times. But I think where mobile phones can come in is just access. It just improves the access, because if you're relying on, getting information from experts, in inverted commas, like your extension officers, then there's just not that many of them. And I don't know whether that's, I guess the public sector here in Kenya is, those extension officers maybe are not, empowered enough, or don't have a motorbike, for example, to get around more quickly.
Yeah.
So that's just one angle. But I think also on market access, I do think that having a more efficient way for a farmer to find a buyer through technology is another way that I think there's huge farmer groups on Facebook where buyers are finding farmers and vice versa. So learning and access to market, but obviously nothing beats face to face. So if you have somebody coming to your plot, doing a demo, walking you through a technique or something, or you have a really educated agro dealer, or it might be like somebody in your church or your community who's willing to go out and train people on the ground, then that's the best. But the next best would be just having better access, I think. So technology is definitely an add-on, but it wouldn't replace face-to-face when it comes to farming. It's really hard to teach some stuff.
Yeah, we talked about it the other day, like you can look at all these YouTube videos about composting, but ultimately it would be so nice for someone to show you how to do it and help you set it up.
Yeah.
I think there's this really interesting space with tech and farming, and when people are talking about impact, they're talking about millions of smallholders being impacted by businesses, and that's where digital can play quite a big part. But I still worry that maybe there's some other needs that farmers have that can't be solved by that.
No. Yeah, I think it's right that people are skeptical about how far, technology products and things can really shift the needle. But I think there are specific things where it's a good channel. So if you want to broadcast really accurate weather information to people that don't have a reliable source from the radio, they don't have a TV, there's no other way of finding out about the weather, then people who have even a basic phone, that's a good use. I think if you can get it right and local, and that it's it's actionable, so a farmer can get some information and act on it, that provides good impact, but can be very scalable. I think trying to do more complex things like
techniques, maybe.
Yeah, I think because then you've got so many factors to consider. I remember trying to figure out here's the standard training on maize production, for example. But then you've got to think what soil type, what agroecological zone, what so many different factors. So now you're trying to create training to cover all those bases. So it is hard, but lots of people are doing it really successfully. I do think in parallel with like lots of kind of physical training would be best, and obviously the market is the biggest thing, just having a secure market.
What do you find, Will, in the UK, because you are visiting farmers?
So my new role is this is quite a new company with the Soil Association, and it's called Exchange, and we basically do a baseline assessment on farms. So we're basically assessing them on various indicators, not just carbon. Often these guys everyone just focuses on carbon, but we're also looking at welfare, animal welfare, biodiversity, soil health, which includes organic matter. We look at carbon, look at water, and we're also looking at a social indicator, which we haven't developed yet. But yeah, the assessment is to try and give farmers an idea of where they're at, so that in time they can improve on that. So that's their baseline measure. So for example, you'd measure their soil organic matter and say in 5 years' time, hopefully that will have increased and you will have sequestered some carbon, but what's the question?
And you can get, well, moving on from that, it's quite interesting, the carbon conversation, because I think it's quite a Wild West market at the moment, in that it doesn't seem to be a standardization of like the value of credits. And then we have some people we work in partnership with who are like, please, can you put us in touch with your farms because we want to test some satellite technology that's going to tell us about the amount of carbon in the soil versus actually taking the soil and testing it, which has got to be better, I'm sure, but it's quite expensive. So is the carbon market becoming quite a big thing in the UK for farmers? And is it quite a good way to like find yourself another source of income?
Yeah. Well, the difference between here and there is that over there, agriculture is subsidized in a massive way. So, until we left the EU, farmers were just paid a certain amount per acre of farmland. So they just get a check through for however much farmland you had.
Wow.
Whereas now, since leaving the EU, the UK has changed it, still subsidizing agriculture in a big way, but changing it to saying, public goods for public money. So if you want the public money, if you want that money, you need to prove that you're doing certain good things on your farm, which is why actually what we're doing now with the baseline measures is really helpful, because it gives people an idea of where they're at, so they can then show that they've improved, so they're worthy of receiving the funding. But in terms of carbon markets, I mean, everyone's talking about it, but I haven't met many people who are actually doing it, because I don't think you really need it that much in the UK. I mean, because you've got the subsidies already. Having said that, food is underpriced. Like the farmers without the subsidies would be out of business. So it's kind of like this weird world that we live in the West or in the UK and Europe, where agriculture is subsidized. The price of food is down so low that the farmers are producing below the cost of production, and the only reason they can stay in business is because they've got subsidies to prop them up. So it's kind of silly, really. What we need to do is pay more for food, not buy from supermarkets, buy direct from the farmer, make sure they get a good income from their business. And a lot of farmers I talk to just say, I hate the fact that we farm for subsidies. Like, I just want to farm to make a profit.
But demoralizing.
I want to farm so that my business works, and I don't need all that subsidy stuff. But because of the cost of food, they have to do it that way.
And will that change in the UK? Like, will there be a shift away from that? Because I think I always find it really interesting that food here, I think, is the price it should be. Some things could perhaps be increased. Like, I think with smallholder farmers, it's not so easy. But I often cannot believe how much cheaper a supermarket shop is in the UK compared to here. And all I can put it down to is ridiculous deals, because people want more traffic through their supermarket and more revenue. And it doesn't feel real to me.
That's the thing. I feel like it's propped up by the subsidies. So ultimately what happens is the subsidy goes to the farmer, but then finds its way to the supermarket shareholder. So effectively what we're doing as taxpayers in the UK is you're propping up the supermarket's shareholder income. That's the way I see it anyway. And so that's why I'm so keen for people to not go to supermarkets and build that more relational, direct sales route, or small options like Greenspoon, or like what I did in Bristol, where you've got one middleman.
Yes.
And they're not taking a huge cream off the top. They're making sure the farmer is getting a good price for their
a viable
product.
price. Yeah.
And that's when it can work, I think.
The difficulty here, I think, with this, the cost of food question, it's really delicate because on one hand, you've got lots of people who are hungry every day. And and there is a call for, just generally accessible, nutritious food being affordable by all, of course, but not at the expense of the farmers. And I think this is the issue, is that people think that the price of food in the West is like what we're aiming for, but there has to be another way. Like if you're bringing the price of food down to the point that farmers have to be subsidized, that just is a completely broken system. But then if you have a large part of the population that can't afford to buy good quality food, then you need efficiencies elsewhere. So it's a really difficult one here, but I definitely think that actually one of the things that you'd shared before, Juju, was, what I think Greenspoon is definitely open globally as well, what you're doing in UK, is that importance of like buying, because you hear this thing, buy local, support local, but you don't really understand what that means until you realize what's actually going on behind the scenes. So if you're shopping, always going for the deals in the supermarket, you're saving some money, and whatever, some people will do that and always will, if it's there, and that makes a lot of sense in many ways. But if you're choosing to shop from a place that has less middlemen or less cream taken off the top, then more money is ending up with the producer, which means that that they have a viable living, which is so important because we need to eat 3 times a day.
And like food is so vital, right? So like we should reward those who produce it in a really good way. Like they should be earning more than others who are doing other jobs.
And teachers, the most underpaid people.
Yeah, but it seems crazy.
Yeah, and I remember us laughing, you and I, Will, about like, some statistic like people spend 5% of their salary on food, and we were both like, what? Both of us spend more. I think because obviously we love food, but also we want to buy the best quality we can afford, and make sure that the farmer is getting a fair deal. It's a very sensitive conversation, though. It really is
a tricky one. I totally understand it, and obviously some people are really hard up, and it's so difficult. And actually, but I guess the message is to those who are not so hard up, who are just going, they can afford to buy, say, like they could, for example, afford to buy from Greenspoon, but they go to Cough or another supermarket that remains nameless. Because they're just like hunting for the deals, and they've kind of got this idea that if I save on food, that's going to be a good thing, rather than thinking, hang on, why don't I spend a bit more on food and get good stuff that supports the kind of food system that will be good for future generations
and my family,
and the soil, and the health of my family, and all these things. So it's like trying to think more long term, and like thinking big picture rather than just like what's a good deal today.
And also, I think something that everybody misses is the power of that vote. So the more, let's take an example of a regenerative chicken farm that's just started, and the prices are quite high because the price of production is high and they're small. But as they scale, some of those things will become more efficient, and the chicken will eventually become more affordable. But if nobody votes at the beginning to start buying that product, it just won't get off the ground at all. So if you're in a position where you can support that kind of food system, then would you almost go as far, Will, as to say it's a moral obligation?
Well, I mean, I'm coming at it from a Christian point of view. So I think everything for me is a moral standpoint. So I'm seeing it as my role is to honor the Creator in the way that I live. Obviously, I'm not perfect. No one's perfect. But like, I have a real sense of the urgency of doing it, particularly around food and farming. And so like, it's a massive moral thing for me. And I love to try and encourage other people down that road, because I think it's such a vital part of our identity. I think that's how we're created, is to look after the creation. And food is such a straightforward way of doing it, because you can just 3 times a day, like we're not all going to be a bird conservationist. We're not all going to be able to save turtles or do other things that are going to protect part of the created order. But the thing we all do is eat. So how we eat has a massive moral impact.
Yeah,
And so
I
I think
agree.
thinking of it like that, I'm just like, such a straightforward thing. And then it's such a no-brainer. But the problem, I think, a lot of people think, oh, but I can't do that. And it's like, hang on, what are you thinking I'm saying? I'm just saying you start on the journey, one thing at a time, do what you can manageably, get that into your routine. So like, don't buy flour from the supermarket, try and find it direct, for example. And once you've done that for 3 months, then find the next thing that you can add on. It just starts small. You can't do everything, but you can do something. So you may as well start with that.
Yeah, exactly. So it's quite interesting because, Mas, you've talked about farming God's way, something that Grace does. Do you have that in the UK, or is that just a Kenyan thing?
We have actually came from Zim. Yeah, some guys in Zim started it, and it's gone global, I think. There's definitely some people doing it in the UK, but it's different. They've renamed it to Foundations for Farming or Foundations in Farming, which is cool. There are different people doing it in Kenya under the banner of Farming God's Way. The guys in the UK doing it is more like training. So it's sort of helping people to learn to produce veg on a small plot, and like doing it really sustainably and looking
So
after
they
the
can
soil.
feed themselves and
Feed themselves and the community. Yeah.
But it's basically, from what I understand from speaking to only a few farmers about it in Kenya, is that it's just a very clear explanation for why it's important to look after your soil and not pump lots of chemicals into it. And, sort of seeing it as the soil is the basis of the food you're eating 3 times. So do you want to be eating from good soil or not? And I think that, I think there's just so many moments where the pennies drop and you just think, oh, it seems so obvious, but actually we've been for how many years, I guess like the last 100 years or something, so fixated on convenience, industrialization of agriculture, driving the cost of food down all the time, that it's so hard to come back from that and be like, actually, I should spend a little bit more money on food, because food is what feeds my body, my brain, my kids, everything. And it's supporting a whole industry of people that without farmers, there wouldn't be any food. So I don't know, it just all seems very obvious, but I think we've been in thinking about food and farming and buying food and that whole thing you're saying, relationships about food in such a different way for so long. But I think Farming God's Way is a good way to kind of, for Christians anyway, just to kind of bring it back to like the obvious sort of truths about farming. And
do you talk about food in church?
Yeah, well, Pip and I have started a charity in the UK which does sort of education work around that. So yeah, we do.
Yeah. Okay. So another question that's quite a big question, right? Is around climate change. So I'm driven quite a lot in this business by a great fear and a huge kind of urgency around food systems because of climate change. And there's obviously this imbalance where Africa as a continent is now being seen as the potential, we're going to be a great carbon sink and we're going to offset the rest of the world's and they don't need to do very much because they just send money to Africa and we put it into cool projects or whatever, which I think is wrong. But it does provide actually an income for some really interesting projects. But eventually the West has got to change the way they're doing things. But I'm really driven by that. And I'm quite interested to know, Mouse, in your work with smallholders and things, do you feel like that's also something that farmers are driven for, that it's a very by the idea of climate change and
I mean, well, I think it's very obvious to every farmer. I mean, they're out in the field every day, or so they're noticing the changing patterns in weather, like rains are starting later or earlier. It's not that there's like I mean, there are more droughts and more floods generally, but the way I understand it, and I'm definitely not an expert, is that it's just that when it rains a lot more heavily. So the volume of rain in a short period of time is very different. So we might get the same amount of rainfall, but it's in a much shorter time. So it's actually really damaging for farms who don't have a good soil, who don't have healthy soil and the structure to absorb that water and all that thing. So I think farmers are obviously very aware that things are becoming a lot more unpredictable. I think the issue is that a lot of farmers in Kenya anyway have got very accustomed to growing crops that are struggling nowadays with these longer periods of dry spells, or are just not really the best suited for the conditions we have today. And so I think there's a lot of talk about climate smart agriculture, but it's basically just thinking about what you can viably grow in today's conditions, knowing that it's like getting hotter and you would ideally want something that's a bit more hardy. But the problem, and we talk about this all the time, is the demand. So everybody wants to eat maize, but maize is actually not conducive to a lot of farmland in Kenya. It's hard to grow, it's hard to get a good harvest, but yet the diet is very much like the demand is there for maize. Whereas other things like millet are much more hardy for like parts of like Kenya, but the demand for that is not there. So I think that's why I'm super interested and excited to see more people talking about like the consumer attitudes to like food, what's locally appropriate for our land and our climate today in 2024 and going forward. But then there's also the other side of, working to rebuild the soil. So there's all that kind of rebuilding. There's been a lot of damage to soil and erosion and everything. So I think there's like the fixing the problems of the past, but also thinking about farming from today and not imagining that we were farming 60 years ago in completely different conditions. But the market needs to demand it, I think, and that's where consumer education, and I think that's just one of the biggest things.
Yeah, maybe going back to things that we used to eat and we don't anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, we have, things like the millet bread and things like that, but they just don't move. People aren't used to them.
Yeah.
And I love, saying to the kids, your taste buds are changing quite regularly, so keep trying new things. And today you might say you don't like it, but next time you might like it because your taste buds change. And I think we need to engage a bit more with that childish, like, actually, I should try it. Let me try this and see how it is. What do you think, Will, about the climate change connection with
agriculture,
farming and food?
Yeah, well, I feel like farmers get a really hard time with a lot of the climate change chat, especially livestock farmers. They get a really, cows are blamed for climate change when actually, compared to fossil fuels burning, it's very small. And then, if you want to look at it, when you recognize that methane is different to carbon dioxide, yes, it's a more potent greenhouse gas, but it only lasts for about 12 years in the atmosphere because it breaks down. Then actually cattle are really not as bad as they're made out to be. And for somewhere like the UK, there's just so much land which is ideally suited for livestock, so sheep and cattle, really. There's a lot of rainfall, the grass grows really well, like it's a lot of hills, they're very difficult to farm in other ways. So actually having livestock on them is just very good in a lot of cases, because especially, well, I'm talking about grazing livestock. I'm not a big fan at all of the, centralized, the CAFOs, the industrialized agriculture with livestock. I mean, that's an abomination in my view. But like, letting cows be cows and graze grass and be outside as much as they can be, it's just it's so good for the ecology of farms. Some of the farms we assessed, just the ecology is incredible. And that wouldn't be the case without the cows grazing, because they're helping the diversity in the grassland, but also by being there and allowing the farmer to create an income. He's able to keep she is able to keep the hedgerows in place, and that provides such a vital, habitat. There's just, it's great. So I don't know what that looks like in other parts of the world. Like maybe here you can actually go for the more like the plant-based diet, because you don't have so much grass growth, for example, to feed cattle and sheep. Or maybe it's better suited to browsers than grazers. But then people seem to have a lot of cattle here. So
I mean, everybody loves their nyama. So I think there's no danger of.
There's no danger in like the lack of demand. But whether it works like from a climate perspective is, I don't know, because the key thing about the methane argument is that as long as your herd size is not increasing, then you're not the methane is constant, because it's breaking down at the same speed that it's going up. So if your herd size is massively increasing, then you are having a massive climate impact. So I don't know if that's happening here, then it probably is making an impact climate-wise.
I think from our experience, it's not really happening here. Right.
So
The livestock's really important part of the whole system, and it's
vital.
yeah, they are vital. You know, having pigs on our little shamba at home as tractors, we should have taken soil samples at the beginning and then afterwards. But you can see from the grass how it's growing that it's just so much healthier than it was before they went through. It clearly has like a direct impact there. Talk about urgency, Will, in terms of farming and farming food system. Are you talking about urgency in terms of climate change? Or are you talking about urgency in terms of needing to right the balance?
Change gets more press than than it should, because there's loads of other issues too. So it's kind of like, the biodiversity crisis. There's all sorts of, I feel like the soil health crisis, the water crisis. So I feel like a bit more of a rounded picture is important.
Also the relationship
And the relationships
crisis.
in farming. Yeah. So it's systemic. There's just so many things. I feel like, in a way, not getting too bogged down with like the big picture crises, and more focused on like, what are the actions I can take. I was really inspired by the transition town movement in the UK. They just basically said, look, let's stop moaning about the world and the state of it, and let's focus on positive actions we can take. And so they started writing press releases for, this is like 20 years ago, but like they were saying 2024 press release. We've just, gone off. We've stopped. We don't need a supermarket in our village anymore because people have got into farming and they've producing enough food to feed everyone. Move on. Just like trying to dream of positive ideas that could come and then working towards them. So quite a helpful way of seeing it, and just focusing on positive actions. Obviously, you need to be aware of like the crises as well. Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm motivated by fear, more by hope.
Optimism. What about you, Mouse? Are you motivated by fear or optimism?
Oh, definitely optimism, I would say. I don't like the fear angle because I think it does make just people think it's too big a problem. I can't do anything about it. I'm just one person. It's out of my hands. But I do think governments and policymakers need to catch up. There's some things that I think could be really massive here. So, for example, I saw somebody publish something the other day that was saying, rather than doing fertilizer subsidy, let's pay people for soil services. So, like, invest in soil rather than just a short-term fix. So it's just, I don't know. I mean, that's in reality, could that actually happen? I mean, I think there's lots of deals that have gone on with fertilizer companies and governments in Africa for many years and that kind of thing. But yeah, I think definitely not the fear angle, more the hope, but also I feel impatient about things like we're going down, like I think the aspiration around food, at least what I see in Nairobi on the billboards, all the billboards are fast food companies, and that's fine because they have the marketing budgets and stuff. But also it implies to me, and I don't know this as fact, that people are aspiring to that diet. And you're just thinking this is such a critical turning point, because if we're genuinely wanting to go in that direction, because it seems like success is tied to fast food and, eating a certain diet that people in the West, not everybody, but a lot of people are now very sick from. It seems like we can change that around quickly, but we need, it needs to happen fast.
Yeah, totally.
So I don't know what the solution is, but a bit of policy, lots of customer awareness and education that will then trickle down to farmers and make it viable for them to grow and get paid properly for what they're doing.
Yeah. So as humans that are super aware of this, do you have any like things that you've incorporated into your life, like hacks or like tips or like things that you do on a weekly basis that help you build habits around these beliefs or around the hopes that you have for the future?
Yeah. Well, I mean, some of our stuff will probably be quite UK oriented, but I'll say it anyway. Like, I think the biggest thing for us was we did a year without supermarkets, and that was like such a challenge. But it was like, okay, let's try and do a year without a supermarket and see what we can. We only had a young son at that point, so one child. It gets harder. And then when we moved out, we happened to be in a place where it was actually, there were lots of local shops, there were lots of local producers, so that was helpful. But that's a good challenge, I think. Try and do that. And then also, we say grace. We try and make a practice of trying to think like where the food's from that we're sitting down to. We think about like, hang on, do we know where this has come from? can we actually say thanks for it? Because actually, if I just bought it off a supermarket shelf, I might have no idea who's been involved in the production.
So it could be literally like, I know the carrots have come from Lucy's farm, and I know that the chicken came from Farmer Max, for instance, and it's just sending out the vibes and saying grace.
Yeah, being grateful for where it's come from, being grateful for the people involved in the production, trying to like actively think about it so that it just becomes part of your normal life to be aware of where stuff's come from, which we should apply really, and we try and apply to other things like where your clothes come from. Where's this mobile phone come from? Who's been involved in making this? Like, have they actually had a good time? Is it like actually, a lot of them, like, yeah, it's some terrible stories. Anyway, so, they're big questions, but those are helpful ones, I think.
What about you, Marcy?
I was thinking about that as you were answering. I think one of the things you said ages ago that has always stuck in my mind and comes back to that, like a penny drop moment, was where you said that thing about I know you didn't come up with it, but I got it. Every shilling you spend is a vote for
the kind of world you want.
Yeah.
It's like for the
That's
future.
what I try and think about, is like, it doesn't matter if it's, I mean, Greenspoon obviously is very convenient, but if something is slightly less convenient or slightly more expensive, trying to be like, okay, but this is my decision. I'm actually making a vote here. And I'm thinking, yeah, and I think on the nutrition angle, a bit talking about the understanding food and kind of what as this thing that we eat 3 times a day, and actually it's not just stuff that needs to be consumed and that you don't think about it or talk about it. So I know my kids are not the best eaters, but I do try and say things like, maybe if they say they're feeling a bit sick after eating a bit of birthday cake or something, I'm like, but that's probably because it was too much sugar. Or maybe, I don't know, it's a bad example because it's obvious, but just trying to make them understand that what you eat has an impact on how you feel. And like getting that from the very early days, because then it leads into the idea that if you're eating healthy food, then you're going to feel better. How do you get healthy food? Okay, I need to think about my decisions about buying. And then how do I support the people to make healthy food or nutritious food? So yeah, I think just little things like that, I guess. But we're not perfect by any means.
No, we're not perfect at all. I think we do quite a lot of, or I do a lot of menu planning and thinking about, I mean, I'm always thinking about where foods come from, obviously, but like planning the menu and thinking, okay, another exercise that we did last year was planning the veggies first and then meat as a side, which I found really interesting because it just naturally made us eat more veggies and make them more interesting. And then, of course, we're in a really lucky position where we get to visit farms a lot. But I think there's quite a lot that people can do even if they can't get out to farms. So watch videos and things and feel that connection.
Listen to Greenspoon podcast.
Listen to our podcast. Exactly. Because often it's about developing little habits or about habit stacking. So it's like, okay, if I plan the menu, then I do the list. Then after the list, I do my shopping or whatever, however that rolls. And then it all suddenly becomes just a little bit easier.
So, Gigi, I think something that you do very well is make it fun. And I think like having that, trying to make it fun as well, trying to find the joy in it all. Find, like the good food, oh, it tastes great. Just like really having that celebratory angle to it is a good antidote to the doom and to be a bit too heavy about it, because we can easily get into all these checklists about like, yes, okay, I've done this, I've done that, I've done this, and it's just like a new legalism which creeps in. And then I'm still not quite there yet because I haven't done this and this. But it's like, no, guys, chuck those lists out. Enjoy the journey. Enjoy the journey. Enjoy all the different tastes. Enjoy knowing where your food's come from. Enjoy eating it. Like all these things, like will make it fun. That's what you're doing.
Well, we're trying. I do find though that I've become a bit of like when I go out, I'm asking, where did this come from? And I think often what's happening, and I'm not, I try not to make it like this thing like, oh, I can't possibly order that then because they don't know where it came from. I think, okay, I'm just asking the question because I'm trying to start a chain reaction. So the waiter goes back to the kitchen and says, hey, that customer was asking, where did it come from? Oh, actually not sure, let me check. So I don't have to have the answer, but I just have to ask the question now.
Chef might tell the waiters, okay, this.
this is becoming more important.
As anyone else. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Cool. Do you guys want to add anything else?
No, this has been great chat.
It's so lovely to
Sit here all day.
So nice to chat. So thank you so much for joining us. It's a really fun conversation, really interesting. And I think it's really interesting to think about other parts of the world, because I can get very tunnel vision about just being here and our food systems and how we're doing things. So it's really interesting, Will, for the UK perspective. Thank you. Thanks for your insights as well.
No worries.
And we really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks everyone for tuning in. So I hope that this has been educational and fun and interesting to listen to. See you next time. Thanks so much for listening. And if you've been inspired by this episode, please spread the love. Click on the share button and send it on WhatsApp to a friend you know would enjoy it too. Or do all the usual sharing and liking on social media. It makes a massive difference to us and we're super grateful.